Hello and welcome all to today's Connecting to Collections webinar on storage and handling. I am Priscilla Brendler, Executive Director for Greater Hudson Heritage Network. I'd like to welcome you to the third in the series of Connecting to Collections programs. This is a 5-part series which will focus on the care and storage of historic collections. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, Greater Hudson Heritage Network is the statewide cultural service organization formed to advance and advocate for the preservation and interpretation of historical, ethnic, and cultural heritages. We deliver resource assistance and professional workshop training for heritage keepers who collect, preserve, and interpret in a diversity of uncommon community settings. Greater Hudson also administers the statewide Conservation Treatment Grant Program on behalf of the New York State Council on the Arts. This is a re-granting of funds of over approximately about $100,000 each year since 2000. So for those of you doing math, that's about $2.2 million so far. These funds are distributed to eligible museums and cultural institutions with stewardship responsibilities for collections that are accessible to publics. So these grants support professional conservation treatment procedures to aid in the stabilization and the preserving of these very diverse collections that we have throughout the state. New York State is very fortunate to have this opportunity for the preservation of our collections, since very few states in the whole nation, because only 2, actually have this sort of funding. So we would very much encourage anyone who's interested in preserving any of their objects in their collections to contact us regarding this opportunity. The deadline for the next grant round is June 2nd. If you'd like more information on the grant, it can be found on the Greater Hudson website, which is www.greaterhudson.org. For today's webinar, we have participants from across the state. They're coming from Eastern Long Island, from the Thousand Islands, Manhattan to Buffalo, and basically everywhere in between. I would like to welcome all of our international partners and participants. There are several of you who are logging in, and we're delighted that you made the time and the effort to adjust to our time zone to be with us today. We wish to thank the Institute for Museum and Library Services for providing funding for this program through the statewide Connecting to Collections Grant Program. Thanks to their generosity, we're able to bring you today's webinar. To learn more about IMLS and their granting opportunities, you can visit them at www.imls.gov. Now, what is the Connecting to Collections program? Well, Connecting to New York's Collections program is a partnership between Greater Hudson Heritage Network and other heritage organizations throughout New York State, which address specific preservation training needs in connection with the collection types identified in the statewide survey as at risk in New York's planning project. The collections that were deemed at greater risk are books and paper, photographic collections, digital materials, and historic objects. Training is being provided via this 4-part webinar series. This is the series number 3, which we're going to begin today. Web-based how-to video tutorials providing instruction to organizational staff and to more general audience who may have personal collections that need a little bit of conservation help as well. There's a statewide interactive cross-disciplinary knowledge portal website that serves as a clearinghouse for preservation best practices as a landing page for disaster preparedness plans. So when in doubt, you need conservation information, that's your go-to website for it. And finally, we have our Circuit Rider mentoring program. This is serving each of the 9 regions throughout New York State, providing free site assessment and site visits for collections care. I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the program. All of these activities will reach, we're hoping, about 5,000 cultural institutions throughout New York, and this opportunity goes on through October 31st of 2014. Today's webinar is the first of a 5-part series aimed at providing in-depth training on the care, handling, and storage of collections focused on best practices and low-tech solutions. Today we will analyze the best practice and standards for organizing and furnishing collection storage rooms on a budget, something we all face. These webinars are designed for staff and volunteers at museums, historical societies, libraries, and archives, anyone who works in an institution who works with collections. Today's webinar is seen as the important introduction to the series. think of it as a Collections 101. It's a requirement for electing to continue with the following 4 webinars. There will be 1 webinar a month through the rest of the winter and the spring as we focus on the 4 collection types. We will first discuss books and paper in February, followed by photographs in March, Historic Objects Part 1, which will be looking at ceramics, metal and wooden objects, archaeological and ethnographic objects, and furniture in April, and Historic Objects Part 2, looking at paintings, decorative arts, and textiles in May. You may elect to take one of these webinars or all. It all depends on what kind of collections your organization has. So you can find out more about these different webinars on the website of www.c2cnys.org or by calling Greater Hudson. All the website information and the phone numbers will be the closing slide at the end of today, so you don't have to worry about writing it all down now. Well, today I am pleased to welcome our faculty instructor, Dania Khan. Donnie is a much sought-after consultant who works with small and mid-sized cultural heritage organizations throughout the entire nation, though we're very lucky to have her here in New York State. She has worked in the field of conservation and preservation for almost 20 years, specializing in book conservation and preservation training. She teaches and consults on a wide spectrum of collections care topics and is an adjunct faculty for the Simmons College Graduate School of Library and Information Sciences, teaching preservation management and collections maintenance. Dania is a professional associate of the American Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works, and she earned her BA in Mathematics from St. Olaf College and her Master's in Library Sciences with an Advanced Certificate in Conservation from the University of Texas in Austin. So right now, I'd like to welcome Dania and turn the program over to you.
Okay, thank you, Priscilla. And I am going to bring up my screen so that we all can see what we're doing. And what we're going to talk about today is really an overall look at the care and storage of historic collections, because as Priscilla said, there are going to be upcoming webinars that will go into much more detail than what I'm going to do today. But what I really want to do is give you the general overview of what you really can be looking for in the upcoming webinars. And so what we're going to do is today we're going to look at just what it really means for something to be archival. We're going to look at issues surrounding storage furniture in particular. We're going to look at issues surrounding our storage spaces in particular. And then we're really going to do that overview of storage and handling in practice. So I really was thinking about starting with some initial assumptions. First of all, you have some semblance of intellectual control over your collection, or basically you know what you have and where it is. It's going to be really hard to think and focus on how to store and handle your collections properly if you don't really know what you have. Secondly, we really want to make sure, we're assuming that our storage space is secure. And I'm not talking Fort Knox secure here, but we at least have some policies and procedures for who has access to our storage space, and that that space is locked so that we do have some control over that. And then finally, that our storage space has some semblance of environmental management. So basically, we're not just putting things in the second floor of our garage and calling that our storage space. So we have some control over that environment, so we are doing something. Because again, if we don't really have any control over the environment where we're storing materials, everything that we're going to talk about today is going to be rather a moot point, because we have a much larger problem we have to deal with first. So I'm sure many of us have leafed through the catalogs and looking for storage materials, storage containers, and we keep coming across this word archival, and we think that that's really what we should be looking for. But archival is a term that really is not measurable. It does not have a real concrete codified definition. It implies that materials are going to be chemically stable for the long term, but in and of that word itself, it does not tell us why that is. And so if something in your catalog is only labeled archival. You want to call that supplier and ask them why they are labeling it that way. And if they can't tell you, don't buy it, because there is a really big question mark over that material. Because we're all working on constrained budgets, because what we're really looking at here today is what we can do on those small budgets. What is, low cost, budget conscious ways to store our materials. And if we're just buying materials that are marked archival, that's probably not the best use of our money, because when they stick the word archival on, they can jack up the price. But if that material is not going to have a long life, it's not going to be worth our money. So what we want to see looking at is buying our paper products that are acid-free, lignin-free, and buffered. These are the paper products that are going to last the longest, so you don't have to be rebuying them as frequently. So acid-free, in and of itself, the paper product has a pH of 7 to 7.5 at the time of manufacture. So it's really just got a neutral pH. Now, and that's just at the point of manufacture, so that doesn't take into account what's happening to the paper after it leaves the company, the paper mill, and before you buy it. So it can absorb acid while it's waiting for you to purchase it and really not be of a good benefit for you. So we don't want to just look at acid-free. Although acid-free is a good idea, it's not the only condition that we want to look at. Basically, we all know photocopy paper isn't necessarily, that you just buy generally at Staples, isn't the best paper to be buying, but it will read acid-free, but it is only acid-free. What we want then is paper that is not only acid-free, but also lignin-free. And this is paper that is produced either from cotton or linen, or it's wood pulp that has had the lignin removed. And if you're not familiar with what lignin is, think about newsprint. So our modern newsprint that goes yellow and then brown and gets all brittle is wood pulp paper that still contains a large proportion of the lignin. And lignin is a very unstable chemical compound in our wood pulp papers that is very susceptible to becoming acidic and very susceptible to UV light. And so it breaks down very quickly, generating a lot of acids that then can cause damage to other paper around it. So we've all probably seen an old book that has had a newspaper clipping tucked in its pages, and we can see that dark brown stain on the book pages. That's the lignin really working. So we want paper that is lignin-free and then also buffered. And buffering is adding an alkaline substance to the paper to raise the pH up to about 8.5. And what that's going to do is that alkaline buffer in the paper is going to take those acids being produced by the older wood pulp papers and neutralize them so that they don't spread and so that they don't continue to make the poor quality papers deteriorate more rapidly. So when we're looking at paper products, we want to make sure that they are acid-free, lignin-free, and buffered. And there are people that are going to ask about buffering agents because you will read in the literature that you want some materials to be unbuffered because some of our collection materials are sensitive to higher pH. The trouble is that for the manufacturers of the conservation supplies, we aren't, in the grand scheme of things, major purchasers. These supplies may seem major to us, but we are not major purchasers to the manufacturers. So what we want to do, so what they want to do is they want to be able to make the most amount of materials from similar stock. And so it's very, very difficult to find unbuffered folders or boxes, but what you can find is unbuffered tissue. And that's going to be an interleaving material that we can use for those materials that don't want buffering. And I'll go into that a little bit more as we go through the storage and handling of specific materials. Finally, if you have a little bigger budget and you can spring for it, you can get microchamber paper. And microchamber paper is acid-free, lignin-free, and buffered, but the buffering agent in microchamber paper is of a different chemical composition. So unlike the alkaline substances that will neutralize acids, the chemical compound in microchamber paper actually traps that material rather than neutralizing it. So it's essentially doing the same work, just slightly differently. And so microchamber paper is often used in place of just regular buffered paper as something that can be used for those pH-sensitive materials. It's also, I'm just going to put this little caveat in, microchamber paper is wonderful for reducing odors in certain materials. So if you have something that's has a strong cigarette smoke smell, that mildewy smell, wrapping it in microchamber paper really helps to reduce that odor. It's also great if you make microchamber paper folders for any acetate negatives that have vinegar syndrome. It really reduces the odor. Now you do need to change that out until the odor is all absorbed, but it really works much better than a lot of the activated charcoal and baking soda solutions that you can find. It's really effective. So we have other materials, though, that we use for storage than paper. Although paper is very heavily used, because even if you're looking at objects and textiles, we still use boxes. And so, but if we're not using paper, we want to think about some of the other things that we use. And we want to think about some of the fabrics that we're using. So if we're using fabrics as either dust cloths or wraps or something of that nature, we want to make sure that they are undyed and unbleached, cotton or linen, because those are going to be very stable and they're not going to contribute to the problems that your textiles or any other materials may have. And so anytime you buy the fabrics, you always want to make sure to wash it first, ideally using a free and clear detergent, so an hypoallergenic detergent that doesn't have any perfumes or anything, and definitely no fabric softeners or dryer sheets, because those can put chemicals back into our fabrics that we don't want. A spun polyester is another really good archival fabric to use, and there I'm using archival, I'm sorry. And it comes under the brand names of either Hollytex, Bondina, or Rime, and it all comes in different weights. And so you can get Rime that's very stiff for using as a sling for transporting textiles, so that you've got a really good, robust support system. But it also comes very thin that you can use for wrapping, and very gentle. And okay, here I'm going to lose the technical term for it, poofing up some of the textiles. So if you want to support your textiles, you can use the really thinner spun polyester to poof it up and hold its shape. Eventually the word will come to me. And then also you can use Tyvek fabric, and this is a spun polyethylene. I'm not talking the Tyvek house wrap that you can see. I'm not talking the Tyvek envelopes you can get from the U.S. Postal Service, but in the catalogs you can find unprinted, untreated Tyvek fabric. And this again comes, when you purchase it initially, comes very stiff because it's a highly calendared material, and that means it goes in the manufacturing process. It goes through two very smooth metal rollers first to give it a nice sheen and a nice hard surface. But sometimes we don't really want that. We want our Tyvek to be able to drape and wrap softly. And so you can wash Tyvek fabric. I wouldn't put it in the dryer. That could just end badly. And in fact, I know it ends badly because I've tried it and it just ends badly. And then just wash it in cold water. And that's just going to essentially break up that surface tension and give you a really nice, soft Tyvek fabric in the end. Oftentimes we use plastics as well. For those of you in libraries and archives, you are very well acquainted with the Mylar, or now that Mylar is not the brand name anymore, Melanex. So basically our clear polyester for sleeves. You can use polyethylene. You want to make sure if you're using polyethylene in terms of, say, sheet protectors or pages for photographs that it's uncoated. But polyethylene also comes to us in foam form, and the product names of Volara and Ethafoam. Ethafoam tends to be a little bit, is a more closed cell foam, and so it's a little bit stiffer. Volara is a more open cell foam, and so it's much softer, but both of them are going to be invaluable in helping us to safely store our objects. You can use polypropylene. It's another good, stable plastic, and then acrylics. So if you need to do any sort of moving of collections from place to place, if you need some sort of cover, if you need a stiffener for something, the acrylics are going to be very good. What you never, ever, ever want to use is PVC. PVC pipes might seem like a great idea for helping to build some, neat storage materials. It's easily found, it's easily worked with, and it is about the worst plastic you can ever use because PVC is polyvinyl chloride. And what happens is that the plastics above, the polyethylene, the polyester, the polypropylene, and the acrylics are all very stable plastics. And the plasticizers that are used do not break down. Whereas in PVC, the plasticizers that are in the PVC start to break down the plastic, and then they start to off-gas. And what happens is in the polyvinyl chloride, you start to get the chlorine atoms being released. And first of all, chlorine is not good because it's a very unstable element. And so what it can do is it can start bleaching your collections, but it can also react with the relative humidity in the air. And when you get chlorine and water reacting, unfortunately in the right circumstances, it will form microscopic amounts of hydrochloric acid. And if anybody remembers back to their high school chemistry days, that is a very, very strong corrosive. And so it really is not good for our collections. If you're not sure if you've ever really seen what PVC can do, take down a 3-ring binder sometime and see what happens to those laser printed documents that are in your 3-ring binder. There's a reason why your laser printed or photocopied documents stick to that cover of your 3-ring binder, because that 3-ring binder is covered in PVC and you're getting chemical reactions initiated by the PVC causing the binder in your photocopies or your laser prints to break down and stick to the PVC itself. So if you're thinking plastics, polyethylene, polyester, polypropylene, but never, ever, ever polyvinyl chloride. So we're going to look now at furniture and space and a brief word on the environment because we've already had those workshops. So what we want to be looking for in our storage furniture is something that, again, like we were talking about with our storage materials in being chemically stable and acid-free, lignin-free, and buffered, is we want our storage furniture, in it so far as it can be, to be very similar. So what we want to look for in our storage furniture is either powder-coated steel, anodized aluminum, chrome-plated steel, or baked enamel, because those are going to be much more chemically stable. Unfortunately, a lot of us are going to have storage units that look like this one, where our shelving is made out of wood because it was less expensive, it's easier to work with, it's a great material to use when you have volunteers helping you build shelving, and for many of us, it's something that we inherited. You've got historic buildings with wooden shelves. Sometimes you just can't get around it. But wood is about the worst material you can be using for your storage because it off-gasses. Not only if we're building our storage furniture out of pine, we have to be thinking about any sap that may still be there, but wood also off-gasses formaldehyde, which also really increases the speed of decay for our collections. So we want to think about basically almost anything other than wood or PVC, PVC as well. But then we also want to look at our storage furniture. If we do have some of the powder-coated steel shelves or the anodized aluminum or the chrome-plated steel shelves that you can just buy at Lowe's or Home Depot or Target or Walmart, I'm not saying that you can't buy your shelving there, but what you want to think about when you're looking at your furniture is not so much where you bought it from, but does it comply with some of the following questions? So does your furniture have any sort of rough surfaces, projections, ridges, anything like that? Because if you're storing collections directly on shelving like this, it can lead to a lot of mechanical damage. So deformation, tears, dings, things of that nature. So you really want, ideally, a smooth surface to store your collections on. Now, that's not to say if you have shelving like this that was found in a library, and it's actually very common for older libraries, that you can't do something to change that surface. But it does add extra expense because you do have to go through and line those shelves so you have a smooth surface. You want to make sure that your shelving is of adequate size and strength, because depending on what you're storing, whether it's paper, whether it's ceramic, whether it's stone, whether it's natural history specimens in jars, you want to make sure the shelving is going to withstand the load. I have done so many consulting jobs with libraries and archives where they just purchased the standard, garage shelving from Home Depot with the, metal sides and then a plywood or MDF base, thinking they're putting things in boxes, so this should work. They're not going to worry about off-gassing, but what they weren't thinking about was how heavy those boxes of papers or boxes of books really are, and the shelving was starting to buckle under the weight. And so that not only leads to potential damage for the collection materials, but can be very unsafe for the people working with them, because you just never know when those are actually going to finally collapse. So make sure that whenever you buy this material, take some time, weigh one of those document boxes. Find out how many boxes you're going to be putting on these shelves, and then look at the weight load that those shelves are said to hold. And just make sure that you are buying shelves that will be strong enough. And again, if you're putting anything unprotected or unboxed onto the chrome-plated steel shelves like this that are really kind of a wire mesh, that you are, again, making sure if something is unprotected that you are doing something to make sure that the rough surfaces aren't going to leave their marks. You want to make sure that you are taking care to pay attention to any lubricants or adhesives or other materials that may off-gas. So the cabinets with the drawers may seem great, but what sort of finish is not only on the outside of those drawers, but what's the finish on the inside? What's the finish on the inside of the cabinets? And did they put any sort of oil on to help make the drawers slide out more easily? And then if the doors, form a nice seal when they're closed, what sort of gasketing was used on those seals? Because any sort of gasketing, so foam used for gasketing, adhesives, lubricants, all can cause a lot of damage to our collection. So I'm not saying you can't use cabinets like this, but what you need to do is ask the questions, what's being used, and then find out how that material can protect or damage your collections. And then you want to just make sure, again, that you are taking into account all of the bizarre collections that we may have. So again, is the storage furniture that you are purchasing appropriate for the types of collections that you are using? And if they're appropriate for the vast majority, and maybe not for some, that you are actually using the right sort of supports and, props so that your collections aren't damaged. So basically you want to make sure that, the alligator is not going to start to get wobbly and fall off and attack whomever may be walking through the storage space at that time. So that leads us very nicely into storage space. Oh, let me just go back 1 second, because now that I'm looking at the storage space, I'm seeing an older room with, of course, a lot of wood. If you do have wood shelving, there are ways that you can slow the transfer of those, the formaldehyde and the acids down. In some instances, depending on where your shelving is, it can be coated with either a water-based polyurethane or a water-based latex paint. Don't use oil-based polyurethanes or paints because they can just contribute to the problem. If you're going to use either a water-based polyurethane or a water-based latex paint, be sure you read the manufacturer's directions on how long you need to let that sit to cure. Again, been there, done that, was impatient, and now I have a bunch of books with paint stuck to the bottoms. So read those manufacturer's recommendations. If you can't paint your wood, so if you're maybe in a library or an archive or a museum that has built-in wooden shelves in a historic building, you can line them with the clear polyester sheeting, so that Mylar or that Melanex. And at least it's going to give some level of protection for your collections. Okay, I just want to, there's a lot of other solutions. If you have any questions about those, you can always shoot me an email after the webinar is over, and I would be happy to help you walk through your very specific situation and what some of the options that you have. Okay, so the storage area. Now, I am sure that everyone looking at this picture knows that somewhere in their institution they have a storage space that looks like this. You are not alone. Very few institutions have the staff and the space to really do storage well. But that's why we're taking these workshops. What are some ideas that we can get that will help us transform storage spaces that look like this, or that may, look like this, into something that, is a little bit neater and gives you a little bit more room. So what we want to be thinking about in our storage area, first and foremost, is that the space and the collections have easy access and allow for the safe movement throughout the entire space for those collections. Because we use our collections, we bring them out for exhibits, we bring them out for demonstrations, we may have researchers using them. What we want to make sure is that when we pick up that collection item, maybe it's the, the little covered wagon here, that we can get to that item, we can take it off of the shelf or off of the exhibit case and be able to walk through the storage space and into the research area or the exhibit prep area without damaging that collection item. But if you look at this space, you can see there are things piled on the floor, and so not only is that creating a tripping hazard for the person walking through, but it's also really putting all of those pieces on the floor in great danger of damage, because how easy would it be to be trying to pick something up and accidentally kick something? And so we really want to think about that with our collections. We want to also be thinking about airflow. Do we have good airflow around our collections? And are we practicing good housekeeping? Now, that doesn't mean you're having the janitorial staff at your institution come through and clean for you, but you're making sure that items that could be damaged by a lot of dust, where abrasion is an issue or where mold is an issue, that you're protecting them with dust covers and just giving them the opportunity to be in as safe of a storage environment as they can possibly be, as well as not having your storage space cluttered up with old exhibit panels that, you're never going to use, but you just can't bring yourself to throw away. Don't clutter your storage space up with that. Find somewhere else for it. Don't be storing, and I've seen this, so don't feel bad if you think you're the only one. You're not. Don't be storing your paints and your varnishes and your, heaven forbid, gasoline for the lawnmowers and the snow blowers, depending on where you are. Don't be storing all of that sort of material in with your collections. I know it seems obvious to say, but I have been to too many institutions where there just isn't enough storage space for anything that they start combining spaces, and you really want to try to avoid that. So what we want to be thinking about is having a storage space that has good airflow to really combat mold. That's a big reason why we want good airflow. We also want to think about those storage spaces that have reasonable shelf height for safe retrieval. This is coming from somebody who's only 5 feet tall, so for me, really tall shelves can be very difficult to safely remove items unless you have good step stools scattered all around. So you just want to make sure if you've got tall shelving that you have sufficient step stools. You also want to, though, be thinking about keeping collections at least 4 inches off of the floor, especially if you are utilizing basement storage. It's not the ideal, but if you do need to use that basement, at minimum 4 inches off the floor. In a basement, better to be 6 inches. Because again, for some of us here, we are in the middle of winter, and it might not seem like spring is ever going to come, but it will, and that means we start to run that risk of heavy snow melt and heavy rain, which for a lot of us means flooding. And we don't want our collections to be directly on the floor in any sort of basement situation, or really anywhere, because we just don't know what could be happening. You also want to be thinking about meeting some of the preservation needs of special items. So you can see here in this picture we've got what looks like Velara down on all of the shelves to help protect all of those low-fired ceramics, but they're also using, and maybe not the best thing to be using, but they're also using bubble wrap to create pillows for some of those materials that don't really have a flat surface and need a little bit more protection to keep them from rolling off of the shelf. Is this the most ideal storage situation? Probably not, but an effort is being made. So all we really can ask is that we're not asking you to go from nothing to, the storage like, the Museum of Fine Arts has. What we're asking you to do is incrementally always strive to make your storage space better. Just do it a little bit of a time, and you'll be amazed to find how far you can really get. Okay, there we go. Because what we really want to get to is something that looks very neat and very tidy. It's going to be easy to find just what item in this collection that you're looking for. It's all stable and secure, and it's also, again, at least 4 inches off of the floor, and it's on powder-coated steel shelving. Now, the fact that this shelving is compact storage is probably out of many of our budgets, but just remember, the National Endowment for the Humanities has restarted its grant program for helping institutions improve their storage, so be sure to look for that. Because it is money that you can get. So be thinking about, don't forget that you can get help with some of this stuff. Just as a reminder, I know many of you probably attended the last series on the environment. Set points are going to vary for the different materials that you have, but most collections will be stable at 55 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, with not really wanting to go over much more than 70 degrees. And then keeping your relative humidity between 30 and 60. Okay, we all know that when the humidity starts to get over 60%, that could lead to mold. but then anything below about 20%, and the hygroscopic materials that we have in our collection start to get brittle. And so we really want to avoid either extreme and really try to keep it in that 30 to 60% range. For some of our plastic-based films, so our photographic films, the cellulose acetates and the cellulose nitrates, would really prefer frozen storage. So we may want to think about that if we have significant amounts of that in our collections. If you do, of course, remember in March is the photo storage. We'll talk about that in that webinar. Ideally, try to minimize large daily fluctuations. A lot of movement is going to be very detrimental to a lot of our composite materials that we'll be talking about later on in this webinar. And if the choice is between a steady and cool temperature or a low and stable relative humidity, you really want to go with controlling that relative humidity, because it's with high relative humidities that we start to run into that problem of mold. And mold is a very immediate problem that we want to try to avoid. So sometimes when we're dealing with the environment and we don't have a lot of money, we need to balance what we can do and look at what the damage would be. And so for most of us, mold is going to be a huge issue that we don't want to have to tackle. So we'll let the chemical deterioration speed up just a little bit with higher temperatures to really be able to reduce that risk of mold. So be thinking about the damage that could occur and trying to minimize the most prevalent and problematic of that damage. Don't forget about light, okay? In our storage areas, we really would prefer it to be dark if there isn't anybody in there. Storing your collections in the light is really going to damage them, of course, and we know that, but just remember that from last time. And if you didn't take the environment webinars, I do believe they are recorded, and you can contact the great folks at Greater Hudson Heritage Network to find out how you can see them. So I also want to just say a word about microenvironments, because a lot of times we may have materials that are more susceptible to damage than others, but we don't all have the storage space where we can have dedicated rooms for different types of materials. So what you might want to think about is creating zones within your institution. So maybe you can set up, if you have an HVAC system, you can set it up to run different temperatures in different areas, or if you don't have that, you can bring in dehumidifiers and window air conditioning units to really lower the temperature in certain spaces. So for your most fragile collections, those can go there, whereas if the rest of the building doesn't have reliable climate control, your glass, your ceramics, and things like that can withstand a little bit more variation, and you can just control the environment in one small space. You can also try to create a room within a room, and this is actually done fairly inexpensively. And so you can just basically build 4 walls and a top and insulate that really well, and just within that small room control the environment. So there are options that you can do with that. It could also mean if you are an institution that actually closes for the winter, you can build a temporary room within a room to help combat some of that fluctuation when you turn the heat off in the winter. And just remember that boxes in and of themselves create microenvironments. And so you can do multiple layers of protection around an item within a box, and that's also going to help buffer a lot of that fluctuation. So it's actually the multiple layers and boxing is something that we do with parchment manuscripts and parchment bindings, because parchment is so reactive, but we can't control the environment in most of our book storage spaces to really make sure that the parchment doesn't move if it's out in the open. So we make sure that we're wrapping it and boxing it so that there's a lot of layers to absorb and buffer those relative humidity shifts so that the parchment in the middle of this cocoon is protected. And so that's another way that you can really think about also if you don't have the best climate control and you don't have the money to get special storage spaces, you can create individual storage spaces for certain collection items. So that's something else to think about. So what I want to do now is actually launch into some of the basics of care and handling for a wide range of materials. Now, a lot of these materials, again, are going to be covered in the subsequent webinars in this series, but I want to lay out some of the basics for you so you have some idea of where we're starting from. And the place that I really like to start is with your architecture, with your building. Because when you think about it, your building is really the biggest box holding your collections. And if you don't take care of that biggest box, then it's not going to matter what you do to try to protect your collections within that building. You're going to have problems. So if you have a leaky roof, if you've got rotting wood on your fascia, you know, if your foundation has a lot of cracks, you're just opening yourself up to allowing in moisture, which of course is going to lead to mold, but you're also allowing in insects and rodents, which can do a lot of damage to your collections as well. So we really want to make sure that we are taking care of our building. Now, does that mean having to do really super expensive renovations and remodelings? Maybe it does, but maybe it doesn't. And so what you want to do is just make sure that you're working with the people who run your facilities, or even with yourself, to just be doing conscious inspections of your building. You know, have you noticed any new water stains on ceilings or around windows or on the walls? Look for that water infiltration, especially after a big storm. You know, it's really obvious when your basement floods, but you might not always notice the little water stains on the ceiling, or, you know, check your gutters. Oh, for heaven's sakes, I have seen forests growing out of some gutters. Clean your gutters, because if you don't, it really leads to so much damage. And then also be thinking about checking the drainage away from your building. Do the drains actually and the downspouts actually take the water away from your building, or does the water just sit there and then seep into your basement as damp? Make sure that if you do have an attic, it's ventilated, especially if you're storing collections items up there, and if it is ventilated, that it's got the screen mesh over it to really prevent the rodents, both footed and winged, from coming in and causing problems. And finally, you know, for those of you especially in more historic buildings, always be keeping an eye on going through your basement and looking at your joists. Do you see little piles of sawdust on the floor that you can't explain where they're coming from? If you take a really, a big 10-penny nail and poke it into those joists in the floorboards, does it go in easily, or do you have good, strong foundations for your buildings? Because a lot of times as our wood starts to deteriorate in the construction of our building, the insects move in and they can lead to a lot of damage in the collections. So, don't forget to really be thinking about doing an examination of your buildings. And I really wish I had thought before to take an after picture here, because this building has gone through some really great renovations thanks to a lot of grants from New York State, and it looks so much better now, but for years it had looked like this, and I can tell you there was a lot of leaks and a lot of damage occurring. So definitely take care of your building and really try to advocate for taking care of problems when they're small, rather than waiting for them to become really, really big problems. So just briefly, bound volumes. You really want to be thinking about vertical shelving for your books and for your bound volumes, for the vast majority of them. You'd really prefer them to be upright, like you can see in the little cubby holes in the lower left. If you've got something that looks like the second shelf down from the top on the left or in the middle there right under the light. Okay, lights in your shelving again, not the best thing. You want to make sure that the books are supported, because if they start to lean like that for too long, what happens is the text block starts to pull away from the case, and the binding really becomes weak, and it can lead to a lot of damage. So you want to be thinking about, nice, neat, tidy shelves. I'm a Virgo, so neat and tidy and organized is very much something that appeals to me. For volumes that are oversized, and generally this is more than about 18 inches tall, you want to shelve them horizontally, because their weight starts to go up so much when they get that large that it's actually safer for the volumes to be stored flat. But then you want to make sure that you are not stacking them too high. You only want to stack them 2 or 3 high, because it does start to get difficult to get them out again. And then, of course, if you have any bound volumes that are fragile, some of your older leather bindings, I am sure almost every one of you somewhere in your collection has the Victorian history of your county or your town. Those tend to be in leather bindings that are deteriorating, along with some very brittle paper. Those would definitely want to be boxed, but then probably the biggest culprit of our bound volumes that we want to think about boxing are scrapbooks. And those can just be a nightmare. So in many ways, boxing those is the best thing that you can do with them. So if you do have a lot of bound volumes and you want more detail on what you can do, definitely sign up for the February webinar. I have lost my cursor. Sorry about that. Okay, so briefly, talking about ceramics, glass, and stone. The most common thing that you will find, the most common problem that you will find with these materials isn't reaction to the environment or necessarily the deterioration of the raw materials, but it is actually chips and cracks and breaks resulting in poor handling. And so we really want to think about how we're handling them and how we're storing them so that we can prevent that damage. So what you're seeing on the screen now obviously is not the way to be protecting fragile glass items. And so we want to be sure, again, that we are storing our collections on sturdy shelves, on polyethylene foam if we need to give them that cushion. We're also making sure that we are, again, taking into account weight. Stone, of course, can be very heavy, and so we want to be sure that we are accommodating for that. And you can see here, it's, for the most part, the larger pieces of stone are lower down, the smaller ones are higher up, but, it's something that you are going to have to take into account. You want to make sure that your shelving, as you start to get into these heavier objects and objects that could be damaged through vibration, are well braced and support so that the shelving itself doesn't tip or torque. Okay, we don't want things to just fall off the shelf. So we want to really protect from the wobbles, especially for those of you who may be in areas where earthquakes are not uncommon. And I'm not just talking about the people out in California. Okay, we are talking about the East Coast as well. We've had some tremblers recently that have taken us by surprise, and we don't want to have our shelving collapse because we weren't paying attention to that possible risk. When we're talking about ceramics and glass and things like that, it can be very easy to think about, oh, here's some more stone. Think about protecting it from shifting. Again, we want to think about protecting things from movement that we don't want. Okay, well, I forgot. I must not have a picture. ceramics and glass, it's really easy to think about storing them like we do our dishes and plates at home, right? We are commonly stacking our plates, we're putting bowls into other bowls, putting little things into bigger things because we don't always have the space. We really want to try to avoid doing that, especially if we're not using any sort of padding in between. So we really want to make sure that if we do have to stack anything, even if we're just stacking plates, we're putting padding in between so that there isn't a lot of potential damage done by chipping or cracking. When we have items with lids, really try to resist the urge of attaching the lid to the item with rubber bands, Scotch tape, even museum wax. All of those materials will leave residue and can cause a lot of damage to the collection. So it's almost better if we think about storing lids in conjunction with our the bottoms. So you may think about putting lids in a drawer, and with the accession number, making sure that that's linked to whatever the bottom of the pot is. So there are ways that we can get around this, and even better, if you've just got the lid sitting next to the item, it will help to prevent any chips or damage from happening that you may not want in the future. Don't forget to protect certain items that may need support. So we can see here the sculpture has the arm being supported by a block of wood, especially if you know that you're going to be going through some sort of construction that would definitely cause vibration. You just want to be thinking about some of these things in storage that may be damaged due to vibrations, bumping into things, because you can see his arms kind of sticking out there beyond a false wall. You want to make sure that nobody's going to be walking with a large item and run into that and accidentally break his hand off. And just to note, when you're looking at things like low-fired ceramics, or especially unglazed low-fired ceramics, marble, alabaster, sandstone, all of these much more porous materials, even though you think that, oh, it's pottery, it's stone, it should be safe. Marble, alabaster, sandstone, and low-fired unglazed ceramics are really porous and they're really absorbent. And so any sort of dust and moisture is going to cause a lot of staining. So you want to be sure to protect your materials from that. So you may want to be thinking about throwing dust covers on some of these items. Just making sure that you're paying attention to any cracks or loose items that may want to make you adjust what sort of dust cover you're using. So props, again, are very important. Oh, here's my ceramics. Making sure that things that don't necessarily have flat bottoms are being protected. And here you can see the blocks that are being used to support the vases, I suppose, are Ethafoam, and then you can see some of these items have rings, and you can get Ethafoam or Volara tubing to make your own rings as well, and that can be another great way to just help support your ceramics and keep them from wobbling too much. And finally, don't forget, glass can be very fragile, so if you are storing glass for the long term, make sure that it is well protected with boxes and tissue and all sorts of things. This is just a really good example. When the Corning Museum of Glass was building their new storage or renovating their storage facility, they moved into temporary storage, and you can see how well everything here is packed up, at least as well as they could. So moving on to documents and manuscripts. Oh, again, more on ceramics, glass, stone, etc. in the Historic Objects webinar in April, if I remember what Priscilla said. Documents and manuscripts are fairly simple and straightforward in comparison to much of what we're doing. What you want to pay attention to, of course, is any storage material that you're using. You want to make sure it's acid-free, lignin-free, and buffered. And you also want to make sure that it is the right size for what you're trying to store. I've seen many people try to stuff larger items into a smaller box, figuring, oh, it's paper, we can just curl it over. Paper has a memory, and so once it's folded or curled for a long period of time, it's going to really want to stay that way. And so you don't want to fold things or curl them up and put them into something that you know you're going to need to use again, because then you're just going to have to contact a conservator to treat those items so that they're flat again so that you can use them. So make sure that, you know, your boxes and folders are of the right size. And don't stuff them in there. I know, again, it's really easy to run out of space and just say, oh, we can squeeze in a little bit more. But you have to remember that when you squeeze it in more tightly, you run the risk of damage in removing a folder. And so you don't really want to go and try to pull out a folder from this drawer, because what's going to happen is you could pull out more than one folder and have something go tumbling to the floor. You could abrade other items if you're not grabbing the whole folder. You run the risk of tearing, but then you also run the risk of stuffing too much into, say, a file drawer like this, by having the materials be too high for the drawer, so that when you push the drawer in and pull the drawer out, you're actually raking those folders and those documents against the top of the filing cabinet, and there again you're going to start to cause a lot of damage. And so we want to try to avoid that. What we want are, ideally, our papers packed into nice flip-top document boxes or the handled document boxes that are acid-free, lignin-free, and buffered, all neatly lined up, and then that our folders are filling the box. And if our folders don't fill the box, that we're using a spacer, because again, if we let our folders start to slump in the box, okay, our paper is going to have that memory. Okay, so think about when you're filling up a box, about what your mother said when you were making all of those funny faces as a kid. Don't do that or your face might stick that way. Well, if you let the folders slump, they really do stick that way. So we want to really try to avoid that. Okay. Composite materials. So here we're talking about materials that aren't just made of one thing. Okay, in a certain sense, you can think of books as being like that, because quite often they've got paper, they've got thread, they've got glue, they've got board, they've got cloth or leather, but those materials all move in very similar ways. What we want to start thinking about are those composite materials where not everything moves in the same way. So all of a sudden, I can't remember, I think his name is Buddy. He was a military dog, very well decorated in World War II. And I was just at the American Library Association conference, and there's a whole new children's book out on Buddy. So if your kids like dogs and, you know, all of that, it might not be a good thing. But Buddy here is a really good example of a composite material, because you've got his wooden base, you've got the taxidermied animal, you've got his wool coat that has ribbon, or his medals that contain both silk and metals. You've got his collar, which is leather and metal, and all of these materials are moving in different ways when the relative humidity starts to change. And when you have some things that don't move, like the metals, and something that does, like the wool and the silk, you start to get damage occurring where they join together. And so we really want to think about our composite materials and trying to keep them in as stable of a space as we can. So if we look at this storage space, we do have a lot of, in many ways, composite materials. We've got trunks that are wood with leather coverings and metal fittings. We've got furniture that have legs going into tops. We've got spinning wheels, and I really hope that New York isn't anything like Connecticut, because Connecticut has more spinning wheels than they know what to do with, and they're impossible to store. So I'm hoping you guys are a little bit more lucky. But we're looking more what we're looking at here is this really large storage space. And if you've got a lot of composite materials, you really need to hope that the climate in that space is relatively stable, because in a large space like this, it's hard to control that climate, and the composite materials can really start to move. And so what you want to think about are, if you have paintings. Paintings are a really simple example of a composite material. I'll talk a little bit more about paintings later. But you've got canvas and wood, often a gesso layer, and oil paint. And all of the canvas and the wood are going to move, but the gesso and the oil paint aren't. Your sort of folk art materials, so your old store signs, your whirligigs, or the little, some of your, another good example are the cigar store Indians. If you're shipping, if you're anywhere along the coast on Long Island, you've got the, what are they called? The lovely ladies that would have been right at the bow of the ship. And their name is not coming to me. But painted wood is essentially what I'm getting at, is a really good example too of this composite material. And again, just the type of collection item they were. They were items that were meant to be used and that were meant to be outside, so they've already gone through all of that weather. And they're probably already in a certain way damaged. But what we want to do is try to preserve as much of what's left, and so we really want to try to slow down those fluctuations again so more paint doesn't flake off. We really want to think about, for these materials in particular, not wearing gloves. If you've got things that have flaking paint, whether it's painted wood or painted metal, wearing gloves is really going to cause the paint to flake off. And I'm going to say a few words about gloves at the end, but I just really want to reiterate it right here, that you don't want to wear gloves handling some of these damaged composite materials. Again, with composite materials, unlike this picture, you really want to make sure that you have uncrowded storage space, because again, we want that air circulation to help manage the relative humidity. We also don't want them bumping into each other to cause paint to flake off more. And oftentimes, like with whirligigs and things like that, we may actually have multiple pieces, and so we also want to make sure that all of those loose or broken pieces are all well labeled so that we can be sure to keep those items together, whether each little piece has an accession number or the item is very carefully and obviously packed into a certain box and you know the number of pieces that need to go back in. And I just want to say, as just an aside, these are really difficult objects to take care of, and so definitely if you have a lot of these in your collections, please, please, please take the Historic Objects webinar, because we have so much of our history that is built up in this folk art, because it's not like high art, but it's not documenting the aesthetic, like the Impressionists. But what we're really trying to protect here is the practice. What did signs look like back in the 1800s, in the 1900s? What drew, what sort of marketing practices drew people into stores back then? How did you label that you were, a barber or a dentist or a pub if people couldn't read? And, so we're saving something so much more than just art. We're saving our own social history here. So please, 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 if you have any of these in your collections, take that webinar. Even if it's kitschy, this is part of our history too. Those of you who grew up in the 50s, the space age, that whole concept was so foreign that, it's not something I can understand having grown up after the moon landing, but this is such an important part of our history to preserve, because it just shows, again, a transitional period that, generations that follow just may not understand if these materials aren't there. Okay? And again, uncluttered storage, giving everything its space, giving everything the support it needs, especially if it's damaged or fragile, and then protecting it from dust and light and everything. So, basically what we do with everything. So furniture, again, is in many ways a composite material, but it's in its own little world. It's predominantly wood, but we can get metal furniture, and it can be painted, it can be simply varnished, it can have no treatment whatsoever, it can be upholstered, it can have reed, it can have cane, it can have pressed paper, it can have wooden seats, it can be incredibly fancy and elaborate, it can be very simple, it can be dovetailed, it can just be butt jointed. There's so many variations that go on with furniture. But what all of them have are, again, problems with this change in relative humidity and the movement of the wood. Most of you are probably familiar that in the winter your wooden chairs start to get a little bit more loose and wobbly, and that's because the wood, of course, is drying out because of the low relative humidity. And the same thing goes for, that kitchen cabinet door that will not open in the summer because the wood is swollen so much. And so what we want to try to do with our furniture and storage is to really try to maintain a close relative humidity range between about 45 and 55%, because that's going to help prevent those joints from expanding or contracting too much, and then really loosening up the furniture so that, things start to fall out. You really, 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 for your furniture, want to keep your area clean, and make sure that you're doing regular inspections for odd little piles of dust or sawdust, because what happens a lot with our furniture is it can get infected with the wood-boring beetles, and the only way we'll know that is to really watch for those telltale signs of dust and sawdust. So that means we want to keep our storage areas clean. We do actually want to have some good lighting, and more than anything, we want to make sure that we've got adequate space around all of our furniture in order to be able to see these problems and to maybe know which furniture is the culprit, so that we can get it isolated and taken care of much more quickly. Again, of course, like with practically everything, we want our furniture to be off of the floor, just in case of not only flooding, but also to prevent it from getting kicked or getting slopped by a mop or dinged into by a vacuum cleaner. Our poor furniture goes through enough of that at home. It doesn't need to go through it at our institutions. And speaking of that, we also want to make sure that we're really not taking our historic furniture for granted and using it as office furniture. We want to make sure that this furniture lasts so that people can see it. So if it's a truly unique and important furniture item in your collection, don't actually really use it as furniture. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but it is something that you want to think about. So, if you can pack things in a little bit more tightly, but don't go too much more than what you see here. I have seen some institutions that essentially played Tetris with their furniture, and they had so much furniture packed into spaces that you couldn't actually access 90% of the furniture because it was behind all of this other furniture and there were no aisleways to get to it. And so that's really not doing your furniture any favors, because it's could very much lead to mold because there's not good airflow around it. You never know what's going to be living in the upholstery if you've got upholstery. And if you've got an infestation of wood-boring beetles, you'll never know about it until it reaches the front of the room. So again, all of those storage space issues really, really come into play with furniture because it's so tempting to really just squeeze it in. Again, here I want to just say a couple of words because it's not as big of an issue for many items, but moving furniture has some very important guidelines to follow, and maybe the most important is knowing where to pick your piece of furniture up by. If you're picking up a table, don't pick it up by the tabletop. It may seem like the obvious place to pick it up because it's right there, right? And that's how we do it at home. But with older furniture that may not be the most stable, you have to think about what role all of the pieces in the furniture play. So, for example, a tabletop. Now, the top of your table is really just meant to have things put on it and to hold weight, but it's not meant to hold the weight of anything beneath it. And so if you pick it up by the top, if you've got, you know, some of that, I'm forgetting the era, early 1900s furniture with the huge wooden legs, you know, there's a lot of weight there underneath that tabletop, and the tabletop is not attached to hold the weight of everything beneath it. And so what you want to do is be picking up tables by their legs whenever you can. And again, here, if you've got a table that isn't easily picked up by its legs, you need to plan how you're going to move that table. What sort of props are you going to need to help lift that table up? And then don't forget, again, one of the things I was saying about your storage space, do you have enough room in your space to move this item around without bumping into shelving, without bumping into walls, without bumping into other pieces in the collection? Can you safely move it around? And if you can't, then you really need to start assessing, well, A, do we really need to put this piece on exhibit? Or B, maybe we need to rethink how we're organizing our storage so that we make sure that we give ourselves sufficient room, not only in aisles, but in turning corners. So don't forget about, you know, turning corners and how difficult that can be. And then the other main thing that I want to talk about with furniture, again, is moving chairs. Because we don't want to just move chairs like we do at home. I just grab my chairs by the back and move them around. But they're my chairs. They aren't old, and they're very stable, so it doesn't really matter. But again, if you're moving chairs around, the back and the arms aren't really meant to support the whole of the chair. So again, think about picking it up either by the legs or by the seat. But if you're going to do that, make sure you just check over the whole piece of furniture to make sure that where you're picking it up is actually stable. I've got a couple of old Montville chairs. So if any of you are from around central New York, you may know Montville chairs. And they're a wooden frame with a woven reed seat. And I had bought 2 of them at a garage sale and went to pick up the chair and picked it up by the seat and found out that the rails that formed the edges of the seat, 2 of them were broken, and so the whole seat started going wobbly. So you don't want to do that to your collection materials. So make sure that you know the stability of your items, your furniture items, before moving them. Make sure, you know, joints are well adhered and there aren't any broken bits that could fail in terms of moving them. And then definitely, definitely, definitely go back to kindergarten. And remember how important it was in kindergarten that you worked always on the buddy system. Okay? If you need more than one person, make sure you have more than one person to move something. Don't try to move something heavy by yourself. It's only going to hurt the collection item and hurt you. So, you know, a lot of things to think about. And again, I'm going to just put in a little plug here. If you've got painted furniture, try not to wear gloves. Be really careful with that painted surface. A quick word on metals. Wear gloves when handling metals. The oils in your fingers, when it comes to metals can be extremely damaging. Because metals, although we think they're really strong, if we really think about it, we know that they're not, because they are very susceptible to corrosion. Okay, all of us have had probably at some point a rust bucket of a car. Okay, when cars were still made out of steel, I guess. Okay, if you're of a certain generation, you remember those cars that kids had in high school or through college that you couldn't put anything in the trunk because the trunk had already rusted out, but the car was still going. So we really want to think about corrosion as being the major problem with our metals. And it's not just controlling relative humidity that we want to think about in terms of slowing down corrosion for metals, but we need to be very aware of what airborne pollutants may be around. And for metals, predominantly we want to be thinking about chlorine, sulfur, and then peroxides, because those can really lead to a lot of damage. Tarnishing in silver is a really good example of corrosion that happens, in many of our collections. I don't know of anybody who really, really loves polishing silver, except for my partner Kyle. I'm not quite sure why, but he's the only person I've met that loves polishing silver. However, if you have historic silver, it's not something that you want to be doing on a regular basis, because as you are well aware, whenever you polish silver, you're actually removing a very, very tiny layer of the silver to remove the tarnish to get to the new silver underneath. So if you're, especially if you're dealing with silver plate, over tarnishing can be just disastrous. So what we want to do is think about how we can store our silver without that. And so what we want to think about is storing our silver wrapped in either silver cloth or a tissue that is sulfur, chlorine, and peroxide free. Unfortunately for us, a lot of our paper is manufactured by going through processes that add this to the paper. It's theoretically washed out in the final phases, but you can never be sure. So what you want to do again is, if you're using tissue that's specifically for storing silver, you want to make sure that it is as stable as you can get it, and that's something that you can ask your manufacturer. You also want to be replacing any of these materials periodically, and periodically is probably in the 30 to 40 year range, because they will absorb the pollutants in the air and become less effective. And so just make sure you're noting in your records when you have put something into a storage container, so you know when to go back and check on that. People may have a question. They may have heard something about lacquering silver so that it doesn't tarnish. This is not something you will do on your own. This is something to only really do in conjunction with a conservator, because it's not necessarily the best solution for collections. And finally, I just want to say, if any of you are storing, again, a lot of different kinds of metals, be sure that anything that you're using for padding to help keep them from rolling around, falling off of shelves, so I talked about silver cloth and tissue, but also make sure that you're using, the Volara or the Ethafoam, because those are going to be very stable. They're not going to have components in them that will corrode the metal in and of themselves. Any fabrics that you use, you may want to contact a conservator for any of the materials you want to use to find out if those materials have passed the ODDY test, and that's ODDY. And it's a test that it's really geared towards exhibition case materials, but it's a good way, it's a test that's done with 3 different metals to find out if any of those fabrics, any of the foams, anything like that is actually off-gassing material that will cause the corrosion of the metals. And so it's a good question to ask a local conservator. Okay, and finally, as we've been talking about with everything, Metals may seem like they're really strong, but they will dent, they will break if they are dropped or fall off. So make sure that they're supported on the shelves and that they're supported during transport, especially cast iron. If you drop cast iron, it will crack, it will break. So you want to be really, really careful about that. A few words on paintings. I know we're going to cover paintings in another one of the historic objects webinars. There's a lot of options for painting storage, but one option that really should never, ever, ever be an option is to store your paintings leaning up against a wall on the floor. It's just asking for trouble on so many levels, especially when it's that many layers deep and the vacuum cleaner for the institution is right in the same space. So again, try to minimize the combination storage and utility closet mindset. What we want to do is, again, get our paintings up off of the floor, and we want to store them vertically. And there's different ways that we can do that. You can make bins. Bins are good. You can make wooden bins. You can make metal bins. If you're going to have wooden bins, make sure the wooden bins are painted. And make sure that you've got a layer of either Ethafoam or Volara or foam core on the bottom to give a cushion for the frames, because in many ways our paintings aren't the only thing we're worried about here. The frames have value in and of themselves. And then always have some sort of either corrugated board or foam core between each painting to prevent either corners poking through or from hardware causing damage to subsequent paintings. And by using those nice foam core or corrugated board dividers, you can make sure that you have your accession number so you know exactly where that painting goes. You can put out a digital print of that image right on there so you know what the picture is supposed to be in there, so that it makes doing your inventory much easier. Okay, you know exactly what painting goes where and whether or not it's where it's supposed to be. There's also, of course, storage on walls, and there's a lot of different ways that you can achieve this. On the left, you can see that there was just a metal frame with metal mesh. That was just built for this institution, and it works really well for them. They had compact storage put in, but they needed space for their paintings, and so this is along one of the walls. The picture on the right actually is a system that was put up at an institution where they went to a closing out sale of a shop that had these wall systems for hanging racks and bins and things like that, but they noticed that the hangers for the shelving and the racks would work very well for paintings, and it was very strong, and so on the cheap they were able to purchase this wall system that's powder-coated metal with these metal hooks that's been working out very well for their painting storage, and it was a very economical solution for them. So of course there's also rolling rack storage for our paintings, and again, this does not need to be the high-end, super expensive purchased painting storage. I know an institution out in Colorado that built their own for a fraction of the price, and they, is it as stable and as high-end as the ones that you can purchase? No, but it is possible to build your own. So don't think that these are solutions that can only be purchased from a company. They can be built if you know, by just finding the right people. You want to make sure that, again, any of your paintings, as with everything else, are well off of the floor, that you have a steady environment because these are composite materials. And that please never, please store your paintings flat on top of your ductwork. I don't even know what to say about that. It's difficult to access them. They're getting covered in dust. they are terribly exposed to light, and I don't even know what's happening with the environment when the heating kicks on and off. Please, please, nobody is that short of space. Please. Make sure that you are handling your paintings at the edges, whether you've got frames or whether you've just got naked paintings. Make sure that you're not wrapping your fingers around the back. A lot of these older paintings, the canvas can get very brittle or very fragile, and you can accidentally poke your fingers through, or if it's really humid and the canvas is nice and soft and pliable, you can put little dents in the painting from the back that you don't really know about, and then get the concentric circle rings of cracks where your fingers had pushed through. So the damage is not always immediately obvious. So just always be sure to handle the paintings at the edges and try not to torque them. So don't twist them. Make sure that they're staying perfectly flat. And again, the buddy system works really well for large paintings. If you do have a lot of paintings and you know you move them around a lot, consider putting backing boards on them. That's going to help prevent those fingers from coming through. Make sure you have good airflow behind the paintings if they're essentially in storage on exhibit, especially if they're on exterior walls. You don't want the mold growing behind them and you're not aware of it. And then think about where you are hanging them. Make sure that you're not really hanging paintings over fireplaces that are used or in direct line of any sort of vents, ductwork, or air conditioners, because that being in direct line, so again here in this picture you can see it's really in direct line for that air vent. That sort of air movement causes much greater variation in the environment, and so will cause the paintings, the canvas and the wood, to move more and thus cause more damage to that paint layer. And finally, again, don't forget how you're going to move it, where you're going to move it, and do you have the room to get down the aisle and around the corners and through the doors. Especially with some of your larger paintings, that can be very problematic. Photographic materials, again, this is going to be the March webinar, so I'm just going to give you a real brief lowdown. You really want to try to ensure that the materials that you're using for photo storage have passed the photoactivity test. And this doesn't necessarily mean that they're more expensive, it just means they've gone through the testing, and so you know these paper products, and it's just for paper products, are free of the sulfur and the peroxides and the chlorine that will cause the silver to tarnish, because our black and white photographs and black and white negatives are of course silver based. We want to store our photographs in individual folders if possible, either in terms of the plastic sleeves or in paper folders, and then in boxes or hanging file folders. You can also store your negatives, like you can see here, in the plastic sleeves, the polyethylene or the polypropylene or polyester sleeves, in a 3-ring binder. I would just recommend making sure that the 3-ring binder you're using is not PVC covered. Again, that PVC will release the chlorine, which is going to be very damaging for the silver in your photographic negatives. Glassine, which is the way we often get a lot of our negatives historically, is not a material that we necessarily want to keep our photographs in. Glassine is a very low quality paper and will get acidic very quickly. But we also just, more than anything, want to be aware of just what we are storing. So if we've got negatives, we want to make sure we know if we've got polyester negatives, cellulose acetate negatives, or cellulose nitrate negatives. And what you're seeing here in this image are old cellulose nitrate negatives that are well on their way through the stages of nitrate decay, and the emulsion layer has actually started to liquefy and is sticking to the glassine. And so that's something that we really want to be aware of, because it's going to have a huge impact on how we store these collections and what we ultimately do with them. So if you're not sure if you've got cellulose acetate or nitrate, make sure you come to the March webinar. And finally, in dealing with any sort of photographs or negatives, you really always want to be thinking about, again, these are really just, in many ways, paper type items. And so they're going to curl, they're going to react. Even the cellulose nitrate and cellulose acetate negatives will curl and react to relative humidity. So how are you storing them? Are they protected in storage? Are you storing like-sized things with like-sized things? Are you intelligently utilizing the space that you've got? So if you've got flat files, make sure you're storing the oversized materials in the flat files, and smaller materials can go into boxes so that you have more space and things aren't crowded. We like boxes with folders on shelves, surprise, surprise, nice and neat and tidy. Or you can store your photographs in filing cabinet drawers and in hanging file folders if you want. And so, there's a lot that we can do. What you really want to make sure of is that for storing your photographs is they're in a stable relative humidity, they're in paper materials that have passed the PAT or that are polyester, polypropylene, or polyethylene, and know what you have. So know if you've got cellulose acetate, cellulose nitrate, or polyester negatives, things of that nature. And so for those of you who have these collections, please tune into the March webinar. Textiles, again, have a variety of ways that you can store them. You can store them flat, you can store them rolled, or you can store them boxed. And there's really no way that I can tell you this is what you must do. But what you want to make sure of is when you're choosing is that you are choosing such that storage is flexible, so that you can move things around easily, it's not packed in so much, and that it protects the items from dust. So in terms of rolled storage, this is really a nice idea. They've got the rugs rolled right side in to protect them from the light. They're tied up so they're supported. They're on really good metal tubes with then another tube inside that metal tube to be able to transport them easily. And they're well labeled. I am definitely giving them credit for that, but what would be nice to see is that there is some sort of dust covering on these rugs, because again, for those of you who don't know, dust is not just tiny particles of dirt. Dust is, yes, dirt, but it's also skin cells and hair and dead insect bits and heaven only knows what else in the air. And all of that material in the dust settles onto your collections and is actually a really, really good food source for both mold and insects. So that's why I've been telling you all this time to really combat the dust, because it will lead to much larger problems in the future, not to mention the staining that can happen. So we do really want to think about some semblance of dust covers. The dust covers can be tissue, they can be Tyvek, they can be fabric, they can be plastic. I would just use the caveat, if you are storing textiles in plastic and you don't have good control over your relative humidity, you may want to rethink the plastic. And so this is where something like a Tyvek would be good, because Tyvek breathes, but it does give you that dust protection. And so again here with our textiles, we often want to think about how we can, what we're rolling. I'm going to talk about rolled storage here for a minute, I think. Rolled storage is a great way to condense some really large textile collections. So if you've got rugs, if you've got quilts or other sorts of wall hangings, rolling is often just seems like really the best thing to do. You can do it very economically. Okay, you can buy really great systems. Okay, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do this, but if you're on a budget, you can really get 3 to 4 inch diameter tubes, and they don't, and I'm saying this here, they don't have to be acid-free, lignin-free, or buffered. They can be just regular tubes that you then cover with acid-free, lignin-free, buffered tissue to protect the textiles. You roll your textile on it, you get some pipe with some cotter pins and hang it from chain, and hey presto, you've got a storage system that you can see here. Now, what you really want to think about is what you are rolling. And so if you've got a lot of large textiles that you really want to put into rolled storage, take the Historic Objects webinar in May. I think that's when Priscilla said textiles were, because you don't necessarily want to roll everything. Quilts are kind of a do we roll them, do we not question that you really want to think about. So watch, and I don't have the time to go into all of that thought process here, but definitely take that webinar if you've got a lot of large textiles that you want to roll, because it's not always the best option. The best option, of course, is always storing them flat, but we don't necessarily get that luxury in most of our institutions. So we want to think about, how we are storing things. Okay, so we're always going to be thinking about moving our textiles with supports, whether that's, the rod through the tube for our rolled textiles, whether it's in a box, whether we're taking a flat textile out of a drawer, putting it onto a piece of acrylic or maybe a nice heavy piece of rime and transporting it that way, or we're carrying it on our lovely padded hangers. We really want to be thinking about these things. So for costume collections, they're clothing, right? We want them to hang. They should just hang. That's how we always store them. But we're not going to be hanging them on just any old hanger. Okay, we want to make sure if we are hanging our textiles, we know that they are stable enough to hang. Be sure you do a really good, thorough assessment before you hang any textiles to make sure they're safe to hang. And then make sure you're hanging them on padded hangers so you don't have that really sharp edge right at the shoulder that's going to hold all of the weight that's going to cause a lot of damage. Again, I said flat is best, but then you want to be thinking if you really wanted to take this jacket out of this drawer, you're not going to just carry it around like you would your jacket on, your modern jacket. You want to make sure it's got some sort of support. And so you would want to be thinking about making sure that support is incorporated into the drawer so that you can pull it out safely and carry it safely. When you are storing costume materials or any textile that you need to fold in a box or in a drawer, you want to make sure that it's padded out. And again, like I said, you could use the lighter weight spun polyester. You can use the veil material, the nylon veil material. You can use acid-free, lignin-free, buffered or unbuffered tissue. Now here is where you start to get into where buffered and unbuffered comes into play a lot, is with textiles. If you've got cottons, you've got linens, any of those plant-based textiles want acid-free, lignin-free, buffered tissue. If you're dealing with silks and wools, you want unbuffered tissue, because silks and wools are animal-based and they are naturally acidic. And so by changing that acidity by putting in a buffering agent can cause a lot of damage. And so you want to just be sure that your plant-based textiles are buffered, your animal-based textiles are not. And that is where one of these big buffered versus unbuffered discussions comes in, and why you can always get unbuffered tissue. When in doubt, if you don't know if it's silk, wool, linen, cotton, because that's not your area of expertise, use unbuffered. That way you'll be safe and you can always then get the advice of the experts later on. You know, anything that has a shape, you want to make sure holds that shape, okay? Hats were never meant to be squished flat and stuffed into a box. Hats want to be in the shape of a head. So, you know, make a head. Does it have to be a fancy head-shaped holder from Dorfman? No. You can make your own with some, you know, cotton muslin and some polyester batting, you know, and some frames. It doesn't have to be fancy. It just needs to function. Okay. Oh, if I remember right, these are the folks from the Genesee Country Museum. So they did a big hat rehousing project. So to me, this looks like, you know, muslin with some sort of batting on corrugated cardboard stands. Very low tech, very low cost, but incredibly effective. Okay, so all it takes sometimes is a little bit of creativity. What I do want to tell you is, regardless of how you are choosing to store your textiles, always be thinking about making your choice dependent on which option, flat, rolled, or boxed, okay, is going to mitigate the most potential damage. Okay, and it's because it doesn't matter which way we store it, some damage could occur. What we want to do is pick the solution that mitigates most of that, or the most harmful of that damage. Again, it's like thinking about, well, I really don't have the money for a perfect storage, you know, environmental storage. I can really only control either the temperature or the humidity. Control the humidity because mold and pests are a much bigger problem in the immediate future than the increase in the, you know, chemical deterioration of your materials. So, you know, think about things in those terms, and it will really hold you in good stead, because then you can justify what you're doing. So that is the really brief whirlwind of an introduction to what we want to be thinking about in terms of storage and handling for our collections. Again, the upcoming webinars and the rest of this series are really going to go into the details that I haven't really covered. What I want to mention is that in any of our collections, and this goes for those of you in libraries and archives too, don't think you don't have this stuff. We have hazards in our collections. You know, things like cellulose nitrate, if you've got stuffed or jarred natural history specimens, ordnance and ammo, and it doesn't need to necessarily be that. Photographic equipment, mining equipment, there's so much out there that could be of danger to us. And what you want to think about is, for these hazardous materials, do we need to keep them? What is the value of this particular item to your collection? Okay, is it monetarily valuable? Is it really valuable for research? Is it a core item to your mission? These are things that you want to ask, and this is where, if something isn't in direct line with your mission and it is hazardous, either in terms of health and safety directly to your people or as a potential disaster, maybe you want to have the discussion. Do we document it and get rid of the original? Do we reformat it in the case of negatives? What do we want to do? And if you decide to keep it, the fact that this is a hazardous material needs to be noted in your catalog so that everybody coming after you knows that this is a potentially hazardous material. So one of those potentially hazardous materials, as I was saying, was cellulose nitrate film. It was the first flexible plastic film that we had in use from 1889 to 1951. This again is a cellulose nitrate film starting to go into the weepy emulsion stage. The problem with cellulose nitrate film is it is made from gun cotton. It is highly flammable, and it generates its own oxygen when it is burning, and it cannot be put out. The only way that a fire will cease if it's burning cellulose nitrate is when it has burned up all of the cellulose nitrate. Firemen cannot put it out. So if you know you have a lot of this, you want to do something. If you've only got 1 or 2 negatives that are cellulose nitrate, it's probably not a problem. But if you've got a collection that has a lot of these negatives, you want to think about it. A lot of times it will say nitrate on the edge of the film, but not always. So what you want to look for is the notch code. And the notch code you're really only going to find on sheet film. But what you want to look for is in a corner you're going to see a series of notches. If the furthest right notch starts with a V, you've got nitrate film. If it starts with a U shape, you can see there on the right-hand side, you've got safety film. Safety film will also always say safety film. Safety film is cellulose acetate, and it doesn't burn. It has its own problems, but it doesn't burn, hence why it was called safety film. So again, just be aware, and if you know you have these materials, tune into the webinar in February. We'll talk a little bit more about it. Of course, ammo is something, especially if you're you know, a local historic museum. And again, I'm telling you, even if you're a library, you have a lot of local history items. I can't tell you the little libraries in central New York that I've been to that have museum collections as well. Just be aware of your ammo. Again, if there is a fire, they can be very dangerous. And it is something you want to let your firemen know. You can always, of course, do something about it. And if you do want to, be sure you contact a conservator who can help you walk through what you would need to do to essentially, you know, deactivate the ammo. Okay, your local military reserve, your Army Reserve and stuff can be very helpful. Just let them know it's a collection item and you actually want it back. Okay, a lot of your stuffed animals, especially prior to about 1930, are going to have a lot of incredibly harmful pesticides in them, and many of them prior to 1900 are arsenic laced. Basically, if you want to know if you've got really harmful chemicals in your taxidermy, if your taxidermy is in perfect condition, you've got a lot of harmful pesticides, because that means it's keeping the insects from eating it. First aid kits. Bet you didn't think first aid kits could be hazardous. First aid kits prior to like 1955 contained basically gauze pads that were impregnated with picric acid. It was supposed to be great for dealing with burns, but when the picric acid dries, it becomes incredibly unstable and can be explosive. So just be aware of that, and again, just know what you have. You know, who of us hasn't heard of, you know, either the orange glaze on Fiestaware, which is radioactive, or you may have these Revigorator ceramics in your collection. It was thought right after radiation was discovered that it was really good for you. And so you got basically irradiated pots to pour water into, to put in your refrigerator, and by drinking that irradiated water, it was supposed to be really healthy for you. Okay, radiation comes to us also, you know, if you've got a lot of like photographic development equipment, anything with the old you know, glow-in-the-dark material, that's all radiation at that era. So just really be thinking about what hazards you could have in your collection. Again, don't forget about you know, any sort of old medical equipment, old dental equipment, things like that can all be very problematic for us. So just be aware that there are items out there and that you should be looking through your collections for that. In closing, some storage tips. Okay, again, remember that your furniture and your enclosures for collections should be durable and chemically stable and strong enough to support what they're trying to support, okay, and they should fit. If you're going to spend this money, make sure that your items actually fit. You also want to be thinking about identifying materials in your collections that are actually stored in old, deteriorating, or damaged materials. A lot of us just stored things in the cardboard boxes that we got them in. which, in the short term is fine, but in the long term, we really want to change out those cardboard boxes, not only because they're acidic, but because if you're getting donations coming in cardboard boxes, you don't know what's living in those cardboard boxes. The corrugations are great luxury accommodations for insects, so you want to be thinking about that. And I want to just talk a little bit here about gloves. Gloves are really great for handling metals and photographs and negatives, but really should not be worn with any sort of paper or books, anything with flaking paint or loose items or cracks or chips, because there you start losing your tactile sense, and you're not handling it safely, but also the little hairs in the cotton can catch. Okay, so, paint chips, glazing chips, stone chips, anything like that. So only for metals, photographs, negatives, and marble or alabaster, because those are also very, those very porous stones. So just be aware of, really think about it logically. What could really be damaged by, the oils in my hand, even if my hands are clean and dry, versus what would be more damaged if I have lost my tactile sense and can't safely hold and move and, handle something. Okay? Just, again, be thinking about how we're storing things. Are we protecting from the wobble? Are we protecting from other, items around, so those paintings with the foam core between them, so, things aren't getting punctured or poked. Okay, think about the alligator and his nice, cozy little, storage bin here. He's not going to roll off. Nobody's going to poke him. He's all nice and happy. Okay, we're going to avoid at all costs any sort of pressure-sensitive tapes or labels, rubber bands, paper clips, Post-it notes, standard glues or glue sticks, any sort of adhesives in direct contact with our collection items. Okay? Yes, you can use hot melt glue and double stick tape to the storage material, but never, ever, ever have it come anywhere in close contact to your actual collection item. So just really be aware of that. Anything you're using for storage should be safe and chemically stable. And that's really the overarching concept that I want you all to get, because there's a lot out there. So if you don't have a lot of money, buy acid-free, lignin-free buffered folders before you would spend a lot of money on acid-free, lignin-free buffered boxes, because the acid-free, lignin-free buffered folders or tissue is what's going to be in direct contact with your collection material. And then if you can't afford the really expensive boxes, at least what's in direct contact with your collections should be the most stable. And then over time you can be replacing things as you get more money. In the ideal world, it's all going to be stable, but we know in reality it isn't. So I am going to open it up to questions only in the sense to say that when I turn this back over to Priscilla, she's going to put up my contact information, and I am happy to take any and all questions that you have from this webinar. Please don't hesitate to send them to me. It's not a figure of speech. So I'm going to turn it back over to Priscilla.
Okay, turn it over. Unmuted. Thank you, Danya, so very much. You've all given us quite a bit to think about regarding our care of our collections, and certainly have given us quite a bit of homework to do. As you see on your screen in front of you, there is a resource page on the Connecting to Collections website where we have information that you will definitely want to take a look at as far as some different hints and ideas for working with your collections. So by the end of today, or say by the end of the week, you will receive a web link to the entire recorded webinar. and a copy of the transcript and Donnie's PowerPoint. This way you can go back and review the information at any time, as often as you wish, and since most of it's online, anywhere that you wish to do this. In the same email, you will also receive a program survey. Please, if you could just take 2 minutes to fill it out. This will help us be able to develop workshops that really address your needs and how we can do things better. So the surveys are so critically important for what we do. So please just turn those around as fast as you can, and we appreciate your taking care of that for us in the survey. And I just want to give a little bit of more information on our Circuit Writer program. As part of this program, the Circuit Writer is basically a collections care consultant who will come to your site for half a day and will visit focusing on any collections care issue that your organization faces. The site visits are available for historic house museums, historic sites, historical societies, libraries, archives, basically any organization that has a collection. The Circuit Writers will discuss various areas of stewardship with you. They can help identify your specific collection issues, suggest and prioritize basic steps to improve care for your collections. They'll review your existing documents and forms, provide you with templates, suggestions, basically anything of collections related, they are there to help you. These site visits are free. As you can see that, we have that in uppercase letters. It's absolutely free. No cost to you except for the volunteers and the staff to be there to work with the conservator, or excuse me, the circuit writer. So if you are interested, what we recommend you do is go to the website, which is www.c2cnys.org, and click on the Circuit Writer tab. You'll see there's a form there to fill out, which will be sent, and I will receive it and be able to contact you. Or when in doubt, just email or give me a call. I'm more than happy to talk through your site visit. So again, this is free. They can come back to your site more than once as long as it's on a different collections care issue. And these circuit writers are available until the 1st of October of 2014. So please take advantage of this. This is a fantastic free opportunity for all of us. As you can see, if you have any questions, we have Donia's contact information there. She was kind enough to offer answering any questions you may have, so please take advantage of that. She's a fantastic resource. And you'll see our website and our email address. So you're free to drop us a line at any time. So the next webinars that are coming up will be on Books and Paper, will be held on Tuesday, February 25th from 1 to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And the Books and Paper webinar will focus on the specific requirements for storage and preservation of collections of books and paper. The instructor will explain low-cost DIY techniques, DIY, do-it-yourself, techniques for designing custom boxes, folders, and enclosures, managing and monitoring storage rooms, and explain various retrieval systems and the importance of tagging critical collections in preparation for an emergency or disaster or when that next hurricane comes. Even on a budget, organizations can use creative methods for cost-efficient storage for these vital collections. So we encourage you to please join us for that webinar, and you can find information on that website, the c2cnys.org. So this concludes today's webinar. We'd like to thank Donia Khan, today's faculty instructor, for leading the webinar and for all of her time and fantastic insight on storage and handling collections. I'd like to thank the webinar producer, Carrie Sclafani, who's our program coordinator, for managing all the technical end of things, and most especially to all of our partners. You can see their logos on the side. They have been such a strong supporter and such a vital resource for the presentation of these webinars. We'd like to thank all of them for their time and assistance. And finally, for IMLS for funding today's webinar series. If it wasn't for IMLS, we wouldn't be here today to help you out. So thank you all so much for joining us. We wish you all the best of luck as you take a new look at your collections with a fresh eye, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar on February 25th.